Okay, so when you hear the word philosophy, what's the first thing that pops into your head? For a lot of us, I bet it's, ancient Greece, maybe Plato wandering around the agora having debates.
Or maybe the European Enlightenment, right? Thinkers like Descartes, Kant,
Mm,
wrestling with big questions about existence and reason.
exactly. But what if I told you there's this huge, incredibly rich, and honestly deeply relevant philosophical tradition out there, one that actually challenges a lot of those assumptions we might have?
And it's a tradition that's alive and kicking right here, right now. We're talking about African philosophy.
That's what we're diving into today. And
That-
it's a really compelling area.
It really is. And I think the first thing, the most crucial thing maybe, is to understand that African philosophy isn't just one thing. It's not monolithic at all.
Right, not like some single doctrine everyone agrees on.
Not even close. It's incredibly dynamic. It's multifaceted. It comes from this astonishing diversity of cultures, languages, historical experiences. I mean, think about the sheer size and variety of the African continent and the diaspora.
Thousands of traditions, you said, all feeding into this intellectual tapestry.
Precisely. And that diversity, that richness is exactly why this kind of deep dive is so, well, so necessary, I think.
So our mission today really is to try and unpack some of the core debates, the really fundamental concepts, and, the critical engagements that define African philosophy as people are actually thinking about it and practicing it today.
Yeah, and we've got a stack of really insightful sources here, thought-provoking stuff. We're hoping to, reveal some perhaps surprising connections, some wisdom that really endures.
And give you those aha moments, hopefully, without feeling like you're drowning in jargon or information overload.
Yeah.
That's the goal.
Let's get into it. Hashtag what is African philosophy? Defining the field and its foundations.
Okay, so where do we even start? Maybe with what seems like it should be a simple question, but historically it's been anything but. What is African philosophy?
Yeah, you'd think it'd be straightforward, but defining the field? Wow, that sparked decades of controversy, especially within academia.
And part of the problem, historically, was where the study of African thought even happened, right? It wasn't always in philosophy departments.
Exactly. For a long, long time, if you wanted to study African thought systems, particularly within African universities themselves, you often had to go to, say, the religion department or anthropology.
Which is interesting in itself.
It is. And critically, these departments were often staffed predominantly by foreign scholars, usually from Western backgrounds.
Ah, okay. And that creates its own set of issues, I imagine.
A huge issue, because it led to what you might call the uncritical use of foreign categories. Trying to understand African perspectives using concepts and frameworks developed in, say, Europe.
Like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Sort of, yeah. Imagine trying to analyze, I don't know, Japanese no theater using only the rules of Greek tragedy. You'd miss so much.
You'd get a distorted picture.
Completely distorted, oversimplified, sometimes fundamentally misrepresented, because it was being shaped by these external frameworks, not by really digging into the internal logic, the nuances of African conceptual traditions themselves.
So right away, there's this huge question. How do you even define philosophy in an African context without just imposing these, alien criteria that maybe don't even fit?
Precisely. And one of the biggest hurdles, one of the main arguments used historically to maybe downplay or dismiss traditional African thought as philosophy, it came down to the oral versus written thing.
Ah, the idea that real philosophy needs books, texts, written treatises.
Exactly. The argument went something like, if it's mainly passed down orally through stories, proverbs, dialogues, how can that really be philosophy in the same way as Plato's Republic or Kant's Critique?
Okay, but let's unpack that for a second. If philosophy absolutely requires written texts from the original thinker, what does that mean for someone like Socrates?
Right. His wisdom, his method, it was all dialogue. We only know it through Plato and Xenophon writing it down later.
Or the Buddha. His teachings were oral for centuries before being written. Or Jesus, for that matter.
Their impact is undeniable. Philosophically profound, world-changing even, but based purely on that strict must-have-written texts criterion. Well, they wouldn't make the cut, would they?
Which seems absurd, so the argument doesn't really hold up when you apply it consistently.
It really doesn't. And what's fascinating here is how consistent we need to be. These rich oral traditions that were absolutely fundamental for distributing and preserving knowledge, wisdom, ethical frameworks within early African cultures.
Yeah.
They shouldn't count against there being philosophy. It's just intellectually dishonest, frankly.
Because complex thought doesn't just appear out of thin air.
No. Sagacious thought Wise reflection, which is often transmitted orally, generation to generation. That's the product of serious critical inquiry. It comes from deep reflection, often intense communal deliberation, argument, refinement.
It implies a whole process of thinking it through, even if it wasn't written down at the time.
Absolutely. Whether it's on parchment or held in collective memory and expressed through sophisticated oral forms, the intellectual work is there.
Okay, so that distinction, oral versus written, leads us straight into another really interesting and sometimes thorny debate. This idea of communal thought versus the focus on individual thinkers that we often see in the Western tradition.
Right. Critics, especially those looking at what got labeled ethno-philosophy, sometimes dismissed it by saying, oh, that's just looking for philosophy in a group mind.
Implying it wasn't about individual critical thinking, more like just what everyone in the village believed?
Yeah, like a kind of vague collective consciousness, rather than distinct individuals grappling with philosophical problems. That was the caricature, anyway.
But is that a fair critique? I mean, is that really how it worked?
Well, the counter-argument is pretty strong, I think. It says, look, this communal thought, this shared wisdom, it can absolutely be the distilled result of common reflections by really sharp, philosophically minded individuals within that society.
So not just passive belief, but the outcome of dialogue and debate among wise people.
Exactly. Maybe it's the consensus reached after a lot of back and forth. And, let's flip it around. Think about our modern cultures. What percentage of people today are really engaged in rigorous, philosophical, critical inquiry on a daily basis?
Good point. Probably not that high.
So maybe this distinction between individual thinkers and communal thought isn't quite as sharp or as uniquely African as some critics made it out to be. It makes you rethink how philosophical ideas actually develop and spread anywhere.
So for African philosophers working today, there's this real push, this imperative to bring out the true character of traditional philosophy through deep conceptual work.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It means really digging into the specific terms and concepts in their original languages and cultural contexts, understanding them from the inside out.
But without just slapping Western labels on them.
Critically important. Avoiding the temptation to uncritically impose foreign categories or analytical tools that might distort the meaning. It's a really careful, intellectually demanding process.
And this whole discussion connects to another debate you mentioned, right? The difference between African philosophy and philosophy in Africa. What's the distinction there?
It's a subtle but important one. Some thinkers, like Paulin Hankanji, who we'll definitely talk more about, argued that the term African philosophy could be problematic.
Why? What was the concern?
The concern was that it might imply something. Well, maybe essentialist. Like there's one specific African way of thinking that's radically different from, say, European philosophy. It could risk boxing it in, maybe even reinforcing old stereotypes.
As opposed to?
As opposed to philosophy in Africa, which is seen as a broader, maybe more neutral term. It just refers to any philosophical activity happening on the continent, whatever its style or influence, without necessarily having to be uniquely African in some predefined way.
So it's about whether philosophy is a universal human activity that just takes different cultural forms, or if there's something fundamentally distinct about the African approach.
That's a core part of the debate. The philosophy in Africa approach is often seen as more progressive because it allows for a wider range of work, Africans engaging with logic, metaphysics, ethics, political philosophy, using various tools, without constantly having to justify its Africanness. It avoids potentially ghettoizing the field.
Okay, we've talked about definitions, about oral traditions, communal thought, but what if the very way we try to understand African thought, the categories we use, have themselves been shaped by outside forces, particularly colonial ones?
Now we're getting into some really deep, critical territory. And yes, this is a hugely significant strand in African philosophy. The idea is that the genealogy of African...
Episteme, meaning like the whole system of knowledge or understanding.
Exactly. The argument is that African ways of knowing, their knowledge systems, weren't just observed by the West, but were actively shaped, even in a sense invented, by Western political power, Western ways of thinking.
Oh, so?
Through processes that effectively alienated Africans, objectified them, turned them into the other. The very frameworks used to describe and analyze African societies often served colonial interests.
Wow. So the lens itself was potentially part of the problem.
A huge part of the problem. This connects to the idea of the cost of Occidental modernity. A perspective suggesting Europe's own sense of modernity, its enlightenment, was built partly by negating Africa.
What do you mean by negating?
It means Europe defined itself in contrast to Africa. Europe presented itself as the ideal, rational, civilized, progressive. And to do that, it needed an opposite. Africa was cast as that opposite. Irrational, savage, primitive, unchanging.
And this wasn't just accidental bias.
Not according to this critique. It was often baked into the justification for colonialism itself, the idea of enlightenment by conquest, the civilizing mission. These weren't just political slogans. They were rooted in a philosophical view that constructed Africa as lacking, as needing to be saved or uplifted by Europe. The framework used to understand Africa was in many ways a tool of domination.
Yes, incredibly powerful. And it obviously led to strong pushback from African thinkers.
Absolutely. Powerful critiques of this ingrained Eurocentrism.
Yeah.
You have figures like Sarah Queberhan advocating a historico-hermeneutical approach.
Great. Break that down for us.
Basically, it means not just criticizing Western thought from the outside, but reinterpreting it, rereading its history, questioning its claims to universality. It's about pushing the boundaries of what modernism even means.
So it's more than just pointing out flaws. It's about fundamentally changing the conversation.
And crucially, it's about decolonizing the mind. This is a key theme. And the argument is, this isn't just something the formerly colonized need to do. It's equally important for the former colonizers to recognize the value, the richness, the validity of pre-colonial African thought systems, to see them not as primitive precursors, but as sophisticated traditions in their own right.
Who are some of the key figures wrestling with these ideas early on? I know Placide Tempels comes up a lot.
Yes, Tempels is unavoidable, really.
Yeah.
A Belgian Catholic missionary whose book, Ubuntu Philosophy, published in 1945, was incredibly influential, though also deeply controversial.
What was he trying to do?
His stated aim was actually to rehabilitate the Bantu people in Western eyes. He argued that their customs, their beliefs about magic, their religion, it wasn't just random superstition. He claimed it was based on a coherent underlying philosophy, an ontology of forces.
Ontology of forces, meaning?
The idea that the fundamental reality, the essence of things, people, animals, objects, isn't static substance, like in much Western thought, but dynamic force or vital energy. Airtray, being, is force. He saw this as a consistent worldview.
Okay, so he was arguing they did have a philosophy, but you said controversial.
Highly controversial, because critics accused him, maybe despite his intentions, of still painting the Bantu as somewhat primitive, as being locked into this world of invisible forces, perhaps unaware of material reality in a scientific sense.
Chaining them to an ontology without salvation, as one critique put it.
Exactly. Implying this worldview offered no way forward, no progress. And the idea that Temples truly saw this as philosophy, in the critical, rigorous sense, well, that's often called a persistent myth. He actually distinguished between what he saw as a kind of magical philosophy and maybe some remnants of a truer philosophy underneath. Critics felt he ultimately didn't grant it the same status as Western critical thought.
Interesting. So who built on or reacted against Temples?
Well, a crucial figure reacting, but using a very different method, was Alexis Kagame, a Rwandan philosopher, linguist, also a Catholic priest.
How is his approach different?
Instead of observing customs like temples, Kagame did incredibly detailed linguistic analysis. He looked at the structure of Bantu languages. He argued that the core concepts of their philosophy, particularly their understanding of being, or NTU, were embedded right there in the language itself.
In the grammar.
In the grammar, the prefixes, things like muntu for a human being, kintu for a thing, hantu for place-time, kuntu for modality. He argued these weren't just grammatical categories, but reflected a deep philosophical classification of reality, all unified by this core concept of NTU. It was a powerful argument for an indigenous philosophy found within the language.
And then there's V.Y. Mudimbe and the Invention of Africa. That sounds provocative.
Hugely influential book from 1988. Mudimbe, a Congolese philosopher, drew comparisons to Foucault. His argument essentially was that the very idea of Africa, the categories used to understand African identity, African culture, African history, these were largely constructed by Western discourse.
Invented by the West.
In a sense, yes. Shaped by missionaries, anthropologists, colonial administrators, explorers. Their writings, their ways of classifying and understanding, created a particular image of Africa that served Western interests and became dominant, making it incredibly difficult for an independent, authentic African self-understanding to emerge. The knowledge about Africa was itself a product of power.
But what was the critique of Mudimbe? Did he offer a way out?
That's the main critique. Like Foucault, perhaps, he was brilliant at dissecting how these power knowledge systems worked, how they constructed their subjects. But critics argue he didn't provide a clear alternative, a blueprint for what an authentic African episteme might look like, free from this Western invention.
More deconstruction than reconstruction.
Something like that. And ironically, some noted that his own call for African intellectuals to kind of rise above tradition to become experts perhaps reflected a Western value about how knowledge should be produced. It's complex.
Which brings us back to Paulin Hauntanji. You mentioned him earlier as being critical of African philosophy as a term. He was also critical of ethnophilosophy.
It's very critical. Hauntanji, a philosopher from Benin, really took aim at figures like temples and Kagame and the whole ethno-philosophical project.
Why? What was his main objection?
He argued they were confusing philosophy with collective worldviews, myths, proverbs, cultural beliefs. For Hauntanji, real philosophy had to be something else.
What?
It had to be explicit, critical, individual, and crucially written. He strongly advocated for a scientific establishment of philosophical activity in Africa. He saw philosophy as a rigorous discipline, a science even, that needed to engage with universal standards of rationality and argument.
So no group mind stuff for him. It's about documented, individual thinkers doing rigorous work.
Exactly. He was pushing for African philosophy to be part of the global philosophical conversation, meeting the same standards of critical inquiry and documented argument you'd find anywhere else. He felt ethnophilosophy, by focusing on collective beliefs, wasn't really philosophy in that rigorous scientific sense, and potentially held Africa back intellectually. A very different, much more universalist vision. #par concepts of the African self and world.
Okay, so having navigated those really foundational and sometimes contentious debates about what African philosophy even is, let's dive into some core concepts, starting with something fundamental, the understanding of the self, of personhood and identity. How does that look in, say, Yoruba thought? It sounds quite different from the typical Western view.
Oh, absolutely. The Western tendency, often, is towards seeing the individual as this sort of self-contained atomic unit. Yoruba thought and many other African traditions present a much more complex, multi-component picture of the person.
Multi-component, like what?
Well, in Yoruba understanding, you have several key elements making up a person. There's Ara, that's the physical body, straightforward enough.
Okay.
Then you have Imi. This is often translated as life force or soul. It's non-material, it's considered immortal, it's what grounds consciousness. But it's not quite the whole picture of the person in the way Plato or Descartes might think of the soul. It doesn't have variable qualities itself.
Interesting. What else?
There's Akan, which means heart, but also mind. It's seen as having both a physical aspect, the organ, and a non-material one. It's the source of consciousness, emotions, desires, agency. And it's distinct from Apollo, which is more associated with the brain and logical reasoning.
So body, life force, heart, mind,
Yeah.
anything else?
Yes, and this one is really crucial and unique. Ori.
Ori, what's that?
Literally, Ori means head, the physical head. But philosophically, it refers to this inner non-physical component. It's seen as the bearer of your destiny and also the key determinant of your personality.
Destiny and personality linked in this Ori.
Deeply linked. It's sometimes understood as a kind of spiritual entity, unique to each person. And it's so fundamental to who you are and what your life path is meant to be that Ori itself is sometimes considered worthy of worship, of propitiation.
Wow. So a person isn't just mind and body, but this complex interplay of body, life force, heart, mind, and this destiny-bearing spiritual head.
That's a good summary of the Yoruba view. And you find analogous concepts elsewhere. Like among the Akan people of Ghana, you have Santham and Okra, these dual, non-bodily aspects of the person. There's debate among Akan philosophers themselves about their exact nature. Kwasi Wiredu described Okra as maybe quasi-physical, while Kwame Gyekye argued it's purely spiritual. But the core idea of a multi-component self is common.
Let's go back to Ori and destiny in Yoruba thought. That sounds really fascinating. You said it's the bearer of destiny. How does that work? Is it just assigned?
Well, this is where it gets even more interesting and challenges simple ideas of predestination. There seem to be different ways destiny is understood to be assigned.
Like what?
One concept is akunlayan. This translates roughly as that which is chosen while kneeling down. It suggests you actually choose your destiny, your life course, before you're born, in the presence of the divine.
You choose it yourself. That's unexpected.
It is. It implies a kind of prenatal free will regarding your fundamental path. Then there's akunlegbo, which is more like that which is received while kneeling down. This aligns a bit more closely with the Akan concept, perhaps suggesting destiny is more bestowed or given.
Okay. Chosen or received. Any others?
And ayanmo, which suggests an affixed choice, something that becomes part of your very being, interwoven with you. The idea of choosing it beforehand, Akunlayan, is particularly striking against common Western notions of fate.
But how does this idea of destiny, whether chosen or received, square with the existence of suffering and evil in the world? If destiny comes from the divine, shouldn't it always be good?
You've hit on a major philosophical tension point, one that thinkers like Kwame Gyekye wrestled with, particularly in the Akan context, but applicable here too. Gyekye outlined three sort of core theses you might find. One, God imposes destiny. Two, destiny is always good. Three, destiny is unalterable.
Okay, sounds coherent so far.
But then, as you say, you look at the world. You see terrible suffering, premature death, natural disasters, people seemingly living lives far removed from any notion of good. So, if evil and misfortune undeniably exist, at least one of Gyekye's three theses has to be wrong, logically speaking.
Right. Either destiny isn't always good, or maybe it is alterable.
Exactly. It creates this profound theological and philosophical problem. How do you reconcile a good, divinely ordained destiny with the harsh realities of human experience? It forces a deeper reflection on free will, divine power, and the nature of good and evil. Is destiny a rigid script, or is it something more flexible?
So how do traditions like the Yoruba try to navigate that tension? If destiny isn't always playing out perfectly, what else is involved?
Well, crucially, Yoruba thought places huge importance on human action and character in this life. There's a strong belief that hard work is essential. They use the symbols ease, the leg representing effort, striving, making the journey, and owo, the hand representing skill, labor, creation. Hard work is seen as necessary to actualize a good destiny. It doesn't just happen automatically.
So your destiny might be good, but you have to work for it.
Yes. And even more profoundly, your character owo is seen as capable of altering your destiny. A person of bad character can potentially ruin a good destiny, while someone of good character might be able to overcome challenges or even improve upon a less favorable destiny.
But wait, if character can alter destiny, doesn't that contradict the idea of destiny being unalterable? Especially if, as some might argue, your basic character is part of your destiny.
Exactly, you see the loop. It points towards a more dynamic relationship, which leads to a really key insight. Maybe destiny in this context isn't best understood as strictly deterministic, like an unavoidable fate.
How else could it be understood?
Perhaps more as normative. As in, destiny is what should occur or what one ought to embrace. It's like a divine mandate, a potential path that you chose or received, but which you, through your choices, your character, your effort, or lack thereof, have the freedom to follow, deviate from, or even corrupt.
So it's less like a chain and more like a calling, a potential you're responsible for realizing.
That captures it quite well, I think. It's a blueprint, perhaps, but you're the builder. And the quality of your work, your iwa, matters immensely. It preserves human agency and responsibility within a framework that still acknowledges a deeper, perhaps divinely intended path. Hashtag causality, rationality, and the supernatural.
Okay, let's shift from the self to how the world itself is understood. Thinking about causality, rationality, the role of the supernatural. How does African ontology, the study of being engaged with these, especially compared to a Western scientific view?
Well, there's often been this kind of dismissive Western attitude, assuming traditional African thought is just metaphysical fantasy, while Western science is based on hard facts about nature.
Right, the science versus superstition dichotomy.
Exactly. But philosophers like Albert Moseley really push back against that. He argues, firstly, that you have to critique African ontology within its own framework, not just judge it by external scientific standards. And secondly, he points out, echoing philosophers of science like Nancy Cartwright, that even Western scientific laws aren't perfect representations of reality. Cartwright famously argued that the fundamental laws of physics lie, meaning they're often idealizations that only work under specific conditions.
So the idea that Western science has a monopoly on objective fact is maybe overstated.
It's certainly questionable, and this opens the door to appreciating other ways of understanding causality and reality.
Like how? What about explaining things through unseen forces or spiritual agency? That seems like a key difference.
It often is highlighted as a difference. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, think about this perceived gap between everyday common sense and deeper explanations, whether they're metaphysical or scientific. The problem of invisible agency, unseen things causing effects, which is often pointed to in traditional African contexts. Is it really so different from what happens in modern science?
How do you mean?
Well, think about it. A villager might explain a sudden illness by positing an invisible spiritual influence, maybe traveling along invisible tracks. That sounds non-scientific to us. But then you have a physicist talking about neutrinos particles we can barely detect that pass through solid lead like it's not even there, traveling on, well, invisible tracks through space-time.
Hmm. Okay, I see the analogy. Both involve unobservable explanations for observed phenomena.
Right. Both are, in their own way, puzzling attempts to explain the world using things we can't directly see. We don't immediately dismiss the physicist's explanation as irrational fantasy. So Moseley and others ask, why the immediate dismissal when it comes to the villager's explanation, which might be perfectly rational within its own ontological system? It challenges our biases about what counts as a rational explanation.
That's a really effective analogy. But what about beliefs that seem more directly contradictory to science, like witchcraft? Belief in people having mystical powers to cause harm.
Yeah, that's definitely a prevalent belief in many African societies. And the sources we looked at are quite candid about this. They acknowledge that in environments without widespread scientific education or critical empirical methods, such beliefs can easily get mixed up with fear, falsehood, exaggeration, suspicion, fiction, and irrationality.
So there's an awareness of the potential pitfalls.
Absolutely. There's often skepticism about purely anecdotal reports of paranormal events, partly because they can be hard to verify and are open to fraud or misinterpretation. However, it's also interesting to note, as some philosophers point out, that even within contemporary Western philosophy of knowledge epistemology, there isn't universal agreement on what makes a belief justified.
Meaning?
Well, some theories of justification, like certain forms of reliabilism, focus more on whether the process that produced the belief is generally reliable, rather than whether the person can give explicit, evidence-based reasons for it right now. It's conceivable that some forms of intuition or traditional knowledge transmission could perhaps be argued as reliable processes within certain contexts, even if they seem inexplicable from a strict empiricist viewpoint. It just shows the philosophical landscape of justification is broader than we sometimes think.
And you also mentioned different logical frameworks being used. The Zande poison oracle, for instance.
Right. The Azanda people of Central Africa used this oracle feeding poison to a fowl to answer yes-no questions as a way to determine truth, often about witchcraft accusations. Anthropologist Evans Pritchard, who studied them extensively, noted that their use of the oracle was highly logical and consistent within its own rules. If the oracle gave contradictory results, they had established procedures for resolving the contradiction.
So internally rational.
Internally consistent, yes. But, as Evans Pritchard also noted, it was mistaken from the point of view of the scientific, context-independent notion of reality. It worked within their system, but didn't align with external empirical verification about how poison actually affects chickens.
And the newer logic example, that sounded really counterintuitive.
Also from Evans Pritchard's work with the newer people of South Sudan. He observed that their way of thinking about morality and consequence seemed reversed from a typical Western perspective. For the newer, it appeared that something was considered evil because it is punished, rather than the Western default of punished because it is evil.
Wow. So the consequence defines the act's moral status.
It seems to imply a framework where social consequences, the community's reaction and punishment, are what establish the wrongness of an act, rather than an abstract moral quality inherent in the act itself leading to punishment. It reveals a fundamentally different way of linking action, consequence, and moral judgment.
These examples really highlight how deep these differences in framework can go. And it seems like spirituality and religion are absolutely central to this traditional worldview.
Oh, completely interwoven.
Yeah.
Our sources emphasize again and again that religion isn't a separate compartment of life in traditional African societies. It permeates the entire life. There's often no formal distinction between the sacred and the secular.
Wherever the African is, there's his religion. That's a striking quote.
It is. It contrasts sharply with how religion often functions in the modern West as a private belief, maybe a weekly service, largely separate from work, politics, everyday activities. In the traditional view, the spiritual infuses everything.
And what about the conception of God and spirits?
God is generally conceived as the supreme being, often understood as spirit, invisible, not typically represented by physical idols or images. There's this interesting duality. God is transcendent, existing beyond all other beings, perhaps remote, but also deeply immanent, the one who fills everything, present in all aspects of creation.
And God's will.
Often considered immutable, unchangeable. This leads to a certain acceptance of misfortune, even death, as ultimately being part of God's plan, even if people also seek immediate secondary causes like witchcraft or illness.
And spirits, are they like ghosts?
Not exactly like Western ghosts. Spirits, like the joke among the Akoli and Lango, are often seen as real agents, almost like members of society, not entirely non-physical. They can include nature spirits, but crucially, also ancestral spirits, Jukurwogi.
Ancestral spirits. You mentioned the living dead earlier.
Yes, this is a key concept. The departed members of a family, going back maybe 5 generations, aren't seen as completely gone. They're the living dead, existing in a state of personal immortality, still connected to the family and the community.
And they have a role to play.
A vital role. They're seen as intermediaries. They're kind of bilingual. They understand the language of humans and the language of the spirits and God. So they can relay messages, concerns, prayers from the living to the spiritual realm, and also bring influence or warnings back. They remain part of the social fabric.
It's a very different view of death than complete separation. Someone even speculated about them being like energy clusters.
Yeah, that was an interesting modern speculation trying to bridge the gap, suggesting maybe ancestral spirits could be conceived as contained energy clusters holding memories and personality traits. It sounds a bit sci-fi, but the core point is finding ways to conceptualize persons surviving death, which isn't unique to Africa. Western theism posits souls, angels, even God as incorporeal persons. So the idea of personhood without a physical body has precedence elsewhere.
But there's also criticism about how Western religion, particularly Christianity, interacted with these beliefs, right? The high God idea.
Yes, a significant critique is that missionaries sometimes either invented a concept of a single high God, like Lubanga for some groups, where one didn't quite exist in that specific monotheistic form, or they took existing concepts of a supreme being and overlaid Christian attributes onto it to make conversion seem more natural.
Kind of fitting African beliefs into a Christian mold.
That's the accusation. And linked to that, there's the observation that despite centuries of missionary work and widespread conversion, both Christianity and Islam have often made, as one source pointed, astonishingly shallow penetration in converting the whole man of Africa.
Meaning
The conversion might be more at a surface, cultural level, adopting rituals, names, maybe some doctrines, but without fundamentally changing the underlying traditional worldview, the deep-seated beliefs about spirits, ancestors, causality. This can lead to syncretism, mixing beliefs, or what some call a cultural vacuum, where old ways are weakened but new ways aren't fully internalized.
So is traditional religion dying out then?
It's complex. Many Africans today might grow up without formal instruction in traditional religion, and studying it academically can sometimes feel like studying the past. Yet, paradoxically, many scholars argue it still holds a central place, a crucial role in modern Africa. It persists, maybe subconsciously, influencing ethics, community relations, political thought. Even if it's not always explicitly named or practiced in formal rituals, its resilience is quite remarkable. Hashtag African philosophy's engagement with society and politics. Hashtag individuality, community, and ethics.
Okay, let's shift gears now and look at how African philosophy engages with the social and political world, starting with ethics, community, and the individual. This seems like an area with really stark contrast to typical Western individualism.
Absolutely. That famous phrase, often cited, "I am because we are," really captures the essence. It's the cardinal point of many African views of what it means to be human.
I am because we are. So my identity comes from the group. Does that diminish the individual?
Not necessarily diminish, but definitely defines it differently. The idea isn't that the individual disappears into the collective. Rather, individuality is understood as being nurtured, supported, even helped by communality. Your personhood finds its meaning and fulfillment within the web of relationships. So what does that actually look like in practice? How does it shape daily life?
It means your well-being, your flourishing, isn't seen as separate from the communities. They're intrinsically linked. My success contributes to the group, and the group's well-being supports mine. It fosters a life of, well, give and take. Mutual responsibility is key.
Which means that concepts like individual rights, as understood in the West, based on this idea of individuals as separate self-sufficient atoms who then choose to form a society, might not fit perfectly.
They often seem foreign, or at least need reinterpretation. In this communitarian view, the relationship, the community, is often seen as ontologically prior, or at least simultaneous, to the individual. You don't exist first and then join a community. You come into being within a community. Your identity is fundamentally relational. And this spirit is captured in the concept of Ubuntu, right? We hear that term especially from South Africa.
Yes, Ubuntu is a powerful articulation of this relational ethic. Our sources describe it using terms like transversal thinking and relational moral perfectionism.
Okay, what does relational moral perfectionism mean?
It suggests that the goal of morality isn't just about following rules or maximizing utility, but about perfecting the quality of our relationships. Ubuntu points to a third way of approaching normative thought, one that focuses intensely on how we relate to each other. The moral value lies in fostering a particular kind of social bond, one of empathy, harmony, mutual care, and dignity.
Your pain is my pain. My wealth is your wealth. That really drives it home.
It really does. It highlights this profound sense of shared fate, of deep communion. Virtue, within an Ubuntu framework, isn't just an abstract principle. It's about actively feeling another person's pain, commiserating, showing compassion, being moved to help. When one person suffers, the community, ideally, feels it and responds. Empathy becomes a core moral driver.
How does this deep connection to community and relationality shape broader ethical systems? You mentioned Yoruba morality being tied to religion.
Yes, traditionally, Yoruba ethics isn't easily separated from religious cosmology. Morality is seen as having divine grounding. Things that are forbidden, taboos, or Iwo aren't just social conventions. They're understood as divinely disapproved actions. The moral order reflects the cosmic order.
But even within that, there's room for interpretation and critique, like the example of human sacrifice.
Right, that's a fascinating point from one source. While acknowledging the historical practice, the argument made is that it didn't stem from the core religious demand, but perhaps from a misunderstanding of sacred duty. The claim is that the deity truly desires one's heart, genuine commitment, moral integrity, not literal physical sacrifice. It suggests an internal critique, a more ethical interpretation evolving within the tradition itself.
And this relational view extends beyond humans, doesn't it, towards nature?
That's a really important point made by philosophers like Edwin Etiebo. He argues that African philosophy, particularly drawing from that Ubuntu ontology of forces we discussed, actually leans closer to biocentrism or ecocentrism than anthropocentrism.
Because everything has this vital force.
Exactly. If all beings, humans, animals, plants, rivers, mountains, are seen as interconnected expressions of this fundamental life force or vitality, then non-human beings aren't just resources for human use. They can possess their own intrinsic moral value. In this view, all beings are, in a fundamental sense, of equal value as manifestations of this vital force.
So it naturally pushes back against a purely human-centered view of the world.
It really does. It offers a philosophical basis for a more holistic, ecologically sensitive ethic, rooted directly in the metaphysical understanding of reality. It challenges that common accusation that all traditional thought is inherently anthropocentric.
But what about ethical dilemmas within the human community, especially the tension between being impartial, treating everyone equally, and our natural partiality towards family, friends, our own projects?
That's a universal ethical tension, of course. But the sources highlight how it becomes particularly acute in societies grappling with deep inequality and historical injustice, like post-apartheid South Africa. Because in such contexts, personal privilege, especially for the historically advantaged group, might be directly linked to past injustices. So the natural desire to protect your own interests, to favor your own, clashes sharply with the impartial moral demand for justice, for redistribution, for acknowledging and rectifying historical wrongs.
It creates a really genuine ethical tension, as one source puts it.
Absolutely. And it underscores why, in much African political thought, there's a strong emphasis on the need for robust institutions, a strong state. The idea that you can't just rely on individual goodwill or moral conscience to overcome ingrained partiality and self-interest, especially when privilege is at stake. Institutions are seen as necessary to enforce impartial morality, to ensure justice is done, because individual psychology alone is often insufficient in the face of systemic inequality. ## political philosophy and liberation.
This leads us directly into political philosophy and the struggles for liberation. In South Africa, that seemingly simple question, who is an African, became incredibly charged, didn't it?
Profoundly charged. It wasn't just a demographic question, it was deeply philosophical and political. You had white South African philosophers who were born there, lived there, consider themselves African. Yet the philosophy they practiced, often rooted in European traditions, was generally not seen or accepted as African philosophy by Black thinkers or the liberation movements.
Why that disconnect?
Partly because the dominant philosophical traditions within the Africans' universities, which served the white minority, were actively used to justify apartheid. Things like Copperian Neo-Calvinism, with its ideas about separate spheres and divine ordering of groups, combined with the kind of Neo-Fichtean nationalism emphasizing ethnic identity. These provided the intellectual scaffolding for segregation and white supremacy.
So philosophy itself was implicated in the oppressive system.
Deeply implicated, which meant that for the liberation movement, philosophy wasn't an abstract academic exercise. It was a crucial tool for critique, for self-definition, and for articulating a vision of a just, non-racial society. It was philosophy as liberation.
And figures like Luthuli, Mandela, Biko, they weren't just political leaders, they were engaging in deep philosophical reflection on how to achieve that liberation, especially around violence and nonviolence.
Absolutely. They were grappling with immense ethical and strategic questions. Mandela, for instance, initially saw nonviolence more as a tactic, a pragmatic choice given the circumstances. He described it as a practical necessity rather than an option in the early struggle.
But that changed.
Dramatically. Particularly after events like the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, where police opened fire on peaceful protesters, killing dozens. That kind of brutal state violence led Mandela and the ANC leadership to conclude that nonviolence alone was insufficient, that the regime wouldn't respond to moral persuasion. It led to the difficult decision to form Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed wing. His philosophical stance evolved based on the harsh realities.
And this kind of engaged political philosophy wasn't unique to South Africa, right? You mentioned Nyerere and Nkrumah, Senghor.
Exactly. Across the continent, the leaders of independence movements were often profound thinkers. Nyerere in Tanzania with his Ujamaa, African socialism, Nkrumah in Ghana championing Pan-Africanism, Senghor in Senegal developing negritude, Cabral in Guinea-Bissau theorizing liberation struggles. Their work wasn't just politics, it was this explorative reflection on the African situation aimed at the political empowerment of the African people. They were philosophical architects of post-colonial Africa.
Let's touch on negritude again, Senghor's idea, affirming African cultural values.
Yes. Negritude was a vital literary and philosophical movement aimed at reclaiming Black identity and asserting the value, the distinctiveness of African cultural values after centuries of colonial denigration that portrayed Africa as having no culture or history worth mentioning. It was a confirmation of the being of the African.
But that phrase, emotion is Black as reason is Greek, that caused controversy.
It did. While Senghor likely intended it as a revaluation, saying emotion isn't inferior to reason, just different and equally valuable critics felt it unfortunately reinforced the old colonial stereotype, the classic opposition between African emotion and European reason, rather than fundamentally challenging or dismantling that binary.
And Fanon criticized Sartre's take on negritude.
Right. Frantz Fanon, a towering figure in post-colonial thought, took issue with Jean-Paul Sartre's interpretation. Sartre, in an introduction to an anthology of negritude poetry, famously described negritude as a necessary but temporary stage, an anti-racist racism that would eventually be superseded by a universal, non-racial humanism.
And Fanon objected to that.
Strongly. Fanon felt Sartre, despite his anti-colonial stance, was subtly reducing negritude, fitting it into a predetermined Western dialectical scheme, thereby minimizing its radical specificity and importance as an affirmation of Blackness itself. Fanon emphasized identity being forged in struggle, not just a passing phase. He saw violence, controversially, as potentially necessary for psychological liberation from the colonizer's mindset.
Steve Biko's concept of Black in the Black consciousness movement seems related but distinct. How did he define Black?
Biko's use of Black was incredibly strategic and inclusive. It wasn't primarily about skin color or genetics. It was a political and psychological category encompassing everyone in South Africa who was discriminated against by law or tradition due to not being white.
Yeah.
So Africans, colored, Indians.
A unifying category against oppression.
Exactly. It was a conscious rechristening, rejecting the negative passive term non-white imposed by the apartheid state, and instead choosing a positive, assertive self-identification. Black. It was about refusing to be seen as non-persons and building solidarity and psychological liberation from internalized racism.
And he was critical of white liberals, even those against apartheid.
Yes, his critique of liberalism was sharp. His experiences, for example, within NUSAS, the supposedly progressive national student union, which was white-dominated, showed him how even well-meaning white allies could perpetuate paternalism or fail to grasp the depth of systemic racism. He pointed to things like Ubuntu education, deliberately limiting black access to English, creating inequalities even within shared movements. It convinced him of the absolute need for black people to lead their own liberation, both politically and psychologically.
This focus on liberation also connected to everyday economic realities, didn't it? Like the meaning of work.
Very much so. You have traditional beliefs, like the Yoruba saying work is the cure for poverty, viewing work as honorable and productive. But then you face the modern reality in many parts of Africa. Exploitation, corruption, lack of opportunity, unjust structures. These can make work feel like a curse, utterly demoralizing.
So philosophy had to address that.
Yes. Philosophers defend the right to work not just as an economic necessity, but as fundamental to human dignity, self-respect. Providing meaningful work becomes a core task of the political community. And African communitarianism naturally prompts questions about economic models. Does unfettered capitalism align with community values? Are socialist or mixed paths more appropriate? Economic development can't be separated from human flourishing and communal well-being.
Finally, in politics, what about democracy? Critiques of both one-party states and Western-style adversarial systems.
Yeah, there's been a lot of reflection on finding models that fit African realities. One-party states, common after independence, often suppress dissent. But simply importing Western multi-party systems with their winner-take-all logic often exacerbated ethnic tensions and led to instability, making losers feel permanently excluded.
So what's the alternative? Consensus.
That's a key idea, championed forcefully by Kwasi Wiredu. He advocates for consensual democracy. The goal isn't just majority rule, but decisions reached through discussion, compromise, and genuine consensus, aiming for substantive representation, where everyone feels their voice matters.
How does that work in practice? What if people just don't agree?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it requires what Wiredu calls the willing suspension of disagreement for the sake of agreed action. You might still hold your view, but you agree to move forward with a consensus decision for the good of the community. The aim is to avoid creating permanent outsiders to state power.
And there are traditional precedents for this.
Oh yes. Many traditional African societies like the Ashanti or the Zulu had sophisticated systems for achieving consensus in decision-making. Wiredu argues this isn't just some quaint historical practice, it's a viable, perhaps even superior model for governing diverse modern African nations, fostering unity rather than division. #, challenges, critiques, and future directions. #, the problem of translation and linguistic competence.
Looking ahead, what are some of the ongoing challenges and future directions for African philosophy? One area that seems really fundamental is language itself, the problem of translation.
Absolutely critical. Kwasi Wiredu, again, has done fascinating work on what he terms tongue-dependent problems in philosophy.
Tongue-dependent, meaning philosophical problems that only arise because of the specific language being used.
Sort of. His core idea is that different languages don't just have different words, they possess different conceptual resources. The way a language carves up reality, the assumptions built into its grammar and vocabulary, can differ profoundly. And when you translate directly, you risk a serious loss of cognitive significance.
You lose the meaning or twist it.
Exactly. You might be forcing concepts from one language's framework onto another where they don't quite fit, leading to misunderstandings or apparent contradictions.
Like the newer example you gave earlier, where sayings seemed illogical in English.
Precisely. Wiredu argues that the apparent contradiction wasn't due to the newer being irrational. It was likely because the English translation assumed their use of the verb is meant strict physical or metaphysical identity, like we often use it. But in the newer language, that conjunctive copula might have different functions, different analytical overtones.
So the translator imposes their own language's logic, creating a problem that wasn't there in the original.
That's the danger. It's not about newer irrationality, it's about the potential inadequacy of the translation and the translator's assumptions.
Wow. So this raises a massive question, doesn't it? Are philosophical truths actually tied to the language you express them in? Does language shape reality to that extent?
It's a profound question about universalism versus relativism in thought and language. Wiredu's point isn't necessarily that truth itself is relative, but that our access to certain concepts and the way we formulate certain problems might be deeply influenced by our linguistic framework.
Which means translation isn't just swapping words, it's a deeply philosophical act.
It really is. It demands incredible sensitivity and awareness of these potential conceptual mismatches. The challenge for African philosophy, and indeed for any cross-cultural philosophical engagement, is to avoid this kind of linguistic imperialism, uncritically imposing one's own categories. It requires real intellectual humility. Hashtag African philosophy in the contemporary context.
Okay, so beyond language, what are the broader challenges and directions for African philosophy today? There's a call for epistemic redress.
Yes, a strong sense that the discipline needs to actively acknowledge and address the harms of the past, the colonial distortions, the silencing of African voices, the imposition of foreign frameworks. To be a truthful discipline, it needs to grapple with this history of epistemic injustice.
A philosophy without memory cannot abolish slavery. That's powerful.
It really is. And it means the conversation can't just be about finding the perfect, truly African methodology.
Why not? Isn't method important?
Methods are important, of course,
Yeah.
but the argument is that methods themselves aren't neutral. They often carry hidden assumptions, many inherited from colonial or post-colonial contexts. So the focus needs to be broader than just methodology. It needs to engage with the historical forces that have shaped African realities, African needs, and the very questions African philosophy seeks to answer.
How does this play out in reconciling traditional thought with modern science and ways of knowing? Is it in either situation?
Not necessarily. Wiredu, for example, while sometimes characterizing traditional ethnophilosophy as maybe pre-scientific, definitely doesn't see it as entirely irreconcilable with modern scientific knowledge.
That integration is possible.
He and many others argue it's essential. Being a modern African involves engaging with modern technology, modern economic systems, and modern methods of inquiry, including science. The goal isn't to discard tradition, but to find ways for different knowledge systems, traditional wisdom, ethical insights, and scientific findings to coexist, interact, and enrich each other. It's about synthesis, not antagonism.
And what about truth itself? Does this embrace of different perspectives lead to relativism?
Not for thinkers like Wiredu. He strongly argues against truth being relative to point of view. For him, truth is the objective outcome of rational inquiry, governed by universal principles of logic and evidence. Knowledge, he suggests, is the manifestation presence of being to the human being, implying there's an objective reality that rigorous thought can access, regardless of cultural background. He remains a universalist about truth.
So given all this complexity, what is the role of the African philosopher today? That sounds like they wear many hats.
They really do. Some see themselves almost as intellectual archaeologists, like Cheikh Anta Diop, trying to trace African influences on global civilization, or others recovering traditional conceptual systems. Some are primarily interpreters of tradition, carefully analyzing and explaining specific ethnic philosophies, like Okir with Igbo thought, or Sarah Quiberhan doing hermeneutics. Others might be more like pragmatic collectors of useful philosophical tools, drawing from global traditions, analytic, continental, African, to address contemporary African problems.
It's a very dynamic field.
Incredibly vibrant, lots of debate, diverse approaches, which is healthy for any philosophical tradition.
Which leads to a final point, its place in the university. Is there still a debate about whether African philosophy should meet universal standards or be treated more like, say, Chinese or Islamic philosophy, understood within its own specific context?
That debate definitely continues. Should it primarily aim to meet the standards of, say, Anglo-American analytic philosophy, emphasizing logical rigor above all? Or should it fully embrace its connections to specific cultural and even religious contexts, which is often how traditions like Islamic or Chinese philosophy are approached and respected?
Is there a right answer?
Probably not a single right answer. If you look at the history of philosophy globally, there's always been a spectrum. You have traditions that emphasize universal logic and others deeply embedded in particular cultural narratives or religious revelations. There's arguably room, and indeed a need, for diverse approaches within African philosophy too. It can engage universal questions using globally recognized tools while also drawing deeply from its unique cultural heritages and addressing its specific contexts. It doesn't have to be an either choice. Its strength might lie precisely in navigating that creative tension.
What an incredible journey we've taken. From grappling with the very definition of African philosophy, dealing with colonial legacies, exploring these really unique ideas about self, destiny, community, causality,
to seeing how deeply it engages with the urgent political, social, and ethical realities of the continent and the diaspora. It's just such a rich and multifaceted field.
Absolutely. And it really drives home how these diverse perspectives, these enduring debates coming out of African thought, can genuinely enrich our understanding, everyone's understanding of those big, universal human questions. Questions about justice, identity, how we live together, what truth even is.
These aren't just African questions. They're human questions explored through particular, incredibly insightful lenses. They invite all of us, wherever we are, to maybe rethink some of our own ingrained assumptions about the world and our place in it.
So having explored this incredibly rich tapestry, maybe here's a final thought to leave you with. What if true universal understanding isn't actually found by trying to impose one single framework on everyone, by trying to make all philosophy fit one mold?
What if instead?
What if that deeper understanding comes from genuinely engaging with and learning from all the unique yet interconnected ways that humanity has always sought wisdom, whether that's through ancient Yoruba proverbs or modern debates happening in universities in Nairobi or Cape Town, or even just by taking the time, like we did today, to dive into the profound meaning of being itself from a different perspective?
It suggests that true universality might lie in the dialogue between particulars, not in the dominance of one.
Exactly. Maybe it challenges us to broaden our horizons and really embrace the full global spectrum of human wisdom that's out there.